Hey, hi, how's it going? How about this weather? It sure is something. You know what? Why waste time with these boring intros when we could just start the video? How about that? Weapon balance ideas for the spy. Leave yours in the comments, or don't. We'll start with the Ambassador. I think regardless of how you felt about the pre-Jungle Inferno version, we could all probably agree that it was over-nerfed. Even if you hated it, making it borderline trash isn't the answer. The original reasoning for the change, stated in the balanced blog post from last year, was that they wanted to, quote, reduce the effective combat range to something more reasonable and expected of the spy. And I can understand that. The Ambassador both rewarded Spy for good aim and also made his range basically limitless since crits don't have damage fall off. The original idea from the blog post was to remove the perfectly accurate first shot, but also make it so that the first shot had 50% less bullet spread, effectively making it only usable at close and maybe mid ranges. This one didn't make it into the game, but to me that sounds worse than what we got. You'd be almost unable to hit anything at long ranges unless you got lucky with the spread. And adding critical damage fall off might have seemed like a good idea, and maybe it could work, but the way it is now is just too harsh. It's barely even worth getting a headshot outside of like super close range. And I know there's a fair amount of debate on whether or not the Ambassador even needed to be changed at all. It's a weapon that can be annoying to fight, but it also does require a decent amount of skill to be used effectively. I'm personally kind of indifferent to the idea of nerfing it. It would all just depend on what the change actually was. That said, here's a middle ground idea. Remove critical damage as affected by range, change crits on headshot to crits on headshot at close and medium ranges, and add mini crits on headshot at long range. So now you're back to the good old 102 damage on headshots as long as you're at close and medium ranges. And at long range you'll be doing 46, which for a long range hit, that's not bad. Basically, this would just be the old Ambassador, but you can't snipe people from across the map anymore. Well, you can, it just won't be as effective. I think that'd be fine. Here's a real quick recap on the history of the Enforcer. It came out and it was overpowered. It had literally no downside when paired with the Dead Ringer. Then they ended up changing the main downside and adjusted a few other things, but it was still overpowered. And then they over-nerfed it. And later on after that, they added a broken gimmick onto it. And now, semi-recently, they fixed that broken gimmick. The current Enforcer is okay, I guess. Both of its upsides are fairly situational, but both of its downsides are also relatively minor. It's just mediocre and doesn't really follow a coherent theme. Previously, I would have just said to get rid of the piercing ability since it barely worked and it probably wasn't worth it to fix it. But now that it does work, I guess that could stay. But I do like the idea of a revolver that just does more damage, especially when every other revolver placement has a damage penalty. So here's what I'd say. Change the plus 20% damage bonus while disguised to a regular old plus 15% damage bonus. Then add plus half a second longer cloak blink time and remove the faster spread recovery. The damage bonus is pretty self-explanatory. It'll make your base damage go from 40 to 46. The original Enforcer had the downside that it increased your time taken to cloak by half a second, which is why it didn't have a downside with the Dead Ringer because the Dead Ringer cloaks instantly. There was an idea there. You'd be capable of dealing more ranged damage, but it'd make it harder to escape. The problem was that, 1, it didn't have a downside with one of the most commonly used watches at the time, and 2, the upside is still way better than the downside. A half a second increase in cloak blink time, which is when you become visible if you take damage or bump into someone, was the original downside to the Saharan Spy set bonus. With that downside, the Enforcer would become a decently powerful revolver in direct combat, but it would make escaping trickier. If you get hit while you're cloaked, you'll be visible for a lot longer than you would otherwise. Now, if that cloak blink downside acted exactly like the one on Spy stat bonus, it still sorta wouldn't work with the Dead Ringer. The Dead Ringer has no cloak blink for the first 3 seconds. So instead of this downside just not having an effect, you can make it so it actually adds half a second of blink regardless. Where normally you wouldn't be visible at all, you will now be visible for half a second. Which would probably make the Enforcer pair kind of poorly with the Dead Ringer, but I think that's okay. Oh, and yeah, there are literally only 2 weapons in this game that recover from bullet spread faster. The Ambassador and the Enforcer. Normally it takes 1.25 seconds before you can fire a perfectly accurate shot again, but with those 2 guns it's only 0.95 seconds. It kinda makes sense on the Ambassador since it already has headshot cooldown, but why exactly is that on the Enforcer? Back when it was overpowered, it was just something that made it even better, but these days it's just kinda like a footnote. If we're giving the Enforcer a regular damage bonus and not a situational one, as well as making the weapon better overall, then I don't think it needs to randomly recover from spread faster. This version of the Enforcer would more or less be a straight downgrade to the pre-gunmetal version, but with a situational pierce effect attached to it. Overall, though, I think it'd follow a more coherent theme where you're sacrificing some escape power for a little bit more damage. It might work. The Diamondback is, it's the Diamondback. It's a revolver that gives Spy free crits for doing Spy things at the cost of a minor damage penalty and no random crits. It's overpowered, sure, but I don't think it's as overpowered as it seems like maybe it should be. I find it strange that they nerfed the Ambassador because they felt it was too effective at long range, but not the Diamondback, which can effectively do the same thing but doesn't require getting a headshot. You can kinda go in a lot of directions when trying to nerf the Diamondback. Obviously you don't want to make it bad, but it should probably be at least a little bit worse at what it does. A gripe I have with the Diamondback is that it's not always going to be clear whether or not a Spy has crit stored. If the Spy is disguised, you can't see whether or not his revolver is glowing. Compare that to other crit storing weapons like the Frontier Justice or the Man Melter. If they're out, you can see them. Hey, that Engineer's shotgun is glowing bright red. Maybe I should be a bit more cautious. With the Diamondbacks, you could see someone who you think is on your team, and then bam, suddenly you take 102 damage. Or even if you do know that a disguised Spy is a Spy, you're still not going to know whether or not he's got crit stored. You can't easily predict your play around that. Readability has always been a super important thing in Team Fortress 2. And yeah, Spy can be an exception to that to some extent, but in this particular instance, no, I don't think he should be. To fix this, I think you could just add the downside that the Diamondback cannot crit while disguised. And any stored crits will not be fired until the actual crit shot is fired. Let's say you have 3 crits stored while you're disguised. You fire the first shot, and it's not a crit, and then you still have 3 stored. This forces the Spy to make himself a bit more open and vulnerable if he wants to get the critical shot off. Coming out of a disguise will give enemies at least a little bit more time to react to the situation. But of course, not every time you use it will be straight out of a disguise, so the downside doesn't apply in every case. But it's not going to be as reliable when someone on the enemy team knows you're a Spy. If you're disguised and someone's attacking you, you won't be able to just instantly crit them. And I think that's totally fair. Like I said though, there's a lot of ways you could go about changing the Diamondback. Maybe different downsides, maybe slightly change the upside. I don't know, what do you think? Your Eternal Reward is so cool. It's like one of the only Spy unlocks that actually puts any emphasis on being stealthy. And you instantly turn to the person you kill, and it doesn't show up in the enemy kill feed, and it's cool. As much as I've always liked the concept of this weapon, the pre-Jungle Inferno version was not great. Being unable to disguise on your own means you can't go anywhere near a sentry until after you get a backstab, and you can often get stuck being disguised as slower classes. And it also made it more dangerous to use your revolver after you got a disguise, because you can't just redisguise after you've used it. Ultimately, it was high risk for not so great reward. You can get an instant disguise, which is cool, but it's basically worthless if there's no one else around. If you were using the stock knife, you could just manually disguise as the class you just killed, at that point. And even if there are other enemies around, seeing 2 players morph into one, it just might raise an eyebrow. It's useful if the enemy team is only half paying attention, but it's not gonna fool better players. Overall though, I do like the changes it got. I like being able to disguise using cloak. It's super helpful, but it also still has a cost. Though I'm not super fond of the other downside they added. When we first saw the proposed change in the balanced blog post, the faster cloak drain rate was 50%, which everyone seems to agree was too high. And it was later lowered to 33% when it was actually implemented. Obviously that's not as bad. And it's not the worst downside ever, but I always feel like I need to pair it with the l'étranger to counteract that downside. Now that's fine for those 2 weapons that pair well together. I mean, they're part of a set after all. It just feels limiting. But ever since I saw the new downside, I've thought that you could basically get more or less the same function with a slower cloak regeneration rate instead. The drain rate penalty is mainly there to make it so you need to be more careful with where and how you use your cloak. If you use that cloak to disguise, you might not have enough to escape. A slower cloak regeneration, let's say by 25%, still makes it so you need to be aware of your cloak amount, but it means you could also get just as far into enemy territory as you would with any other knife, without the need for ammo packs. It also means you don't have to equip a certain revolver just to get around the downside. But even then, it still pairs super well with the l'étranger, because shooting people helps you get your cloak back faster. And just like the current downside, it can be kinda gotten around by collecting ammo. Where the current downside is more punishing while you're actually cloaked, this one will be more so in effect while not cloaked. But it will still be nowhere near major enough to discourage actually using your watches. The way I see it, swapping a faster cloak drain rate for a slower cloak recharge just gets rid of some of the more annoying aspects of that downside while keeping the same basic penalty. The Conniver's Kunai is it's a cool weapon, and it's decent. It really amplifies the whole risk-reward aspect of Spy. But a case can be made that the Big Earner serves a similar function, but better. It lowers your health, but gives you a speed boost on kill to either escape or get another backstab with. The Kunai lowers your health significantly more, but it gives you health on kill that you could also use to get another backstab or also use to escape. To start with, the Kunai is generally more risky, but the effect of the backstab can linger a lot longer. Overheal from the Kunai decays much slower than overheal from mediguns, but I might argue that it should be even slower than it is. Let's say we reduce the backstab overheal decay from 2 per second to 1.5. And then, if we want to, we could also decrease the health penalty from minus 55 to minus 50, which would bring your health from 70 to 75. And to keep the max backstab overheal at 3 times the wearer's base health, we could increase the maximum from 210 to 225. So, let's say you get to the max overheal with the current Kunai. This means you have 140 overheal, and if it decays at a rate of 2 per second, that means you could have it for a max of 70 seconds. And that doesn't sound bad at all. But if we're comparing it to the stock spy, I wouldn't necessarily count anything over 125. But realistically, not every backstab is going to get you to the max, so in a lot of cases the overheal is going to last even less time. The health increase is only really beneficial if the person you backstab has teammates around to either absorb some damage from or to get another stab. Backstabbing someone who's alone might not mean anything. The overheal could be gone by the time you get a chance to get another kill. Chances are you're probably not going to be consistently getting backstabs like every 30 seconds. With this hypothetical version, if you manage to get to the max of 225 health, you'll have some form of overheal for 100 seconds, provided you're not taking damage. And about 67 of those seconds will be over 125. But again, not every backstab is going to get to that high. These would all be relatively minor changes, nothing exactly groundbreaking. Really, the main point of this change is to let you hang on to the overheal just a little bit longer, and also very slightly reduce the risk with the health penalty. So the Dead Ringer got nerfed pretty hard in Jungle Inferno. One good thing I can say about the current version is that you actually have to think about when and where you use the Feign. But other than that, I'm not really a fan of the nerf. And I know there were a lot of people who weren't. Though now that it's been out for a while, I don't think it's quite as bad as it could have been. I still don't really like it though. In the Balance blog post from last year, they said they wanted to make the Dead Ringer more predictable to fight against. But Dead Ringer spies are usually pretty predictable, and they're usually not very subtle about using the Dead Ringer. I think instead of forcing spies to use it predictably, they should be punished for using it predictably. The annoying thing about the Dead Ringer is that even if you know a spy is using it, there's very little you can do about it. You can't see if you hit the spy because the first 3 seconds don't have cloak blink, and if you do hit them, you're doing significantly less damage. Even though the pre-Jungle Inferno Dead Ringer was drastically toned down from what it used to be, it still had the problem of being very annoying to fight. It was super easy to use and hard to punish. I'd say we could change no cloak meter from ammo boxes to minus 50% cloak meter from ammo boxes. Pre-Jungle Inferno was minus 35%, but if you do want to make it take a little bit more time to get back, then I think 50% is fine. Then re-add no cloak meter from ammo boxes while invisible, just like it had before. To make it more punishable, I was thinking just straight up remove the additional resistance after the Feign. During the first 3 seconds of invisibility, the Dead Ringer's damage resistance starts at 65% and decreases to the standard 20% over that time. If you have the speed boost and you have no cloak blink, I don't think you need additional resistance beyond what the standard Invis Watch gives. Now keep in mind the actual resistance on Feign would be unchanged. The hit that triggers the Dead Ringer will still do 75% less damage, you just don't get anything extra after that. This means that if you can predict where a Dead Ringer spy will go, you can still shoot him and deal decent damage. And for the Dead Ringer spies, it still functions just fine as an escape weapon. Just don't be super predictable. Don't just run for the health pack or whatever. And one more thing. I figure since this would be a semi-significant nerf to the pre-Jungle Inferno Dead Ringer, I think we could give it at least a little buff in another way. I was thinking by changing the 3 seconds of afterburn immunity on Feign to just 3 seconds of debuff immunity. Currently, you just won't ignite for the first 3 seconds, but this would mean that Jarate, Milk, Bleed, and whatever won't have any effect for the first 3 seconds after the spy fakes his death. If you want to make it so that spy actually has to think and be somewhat subtle when using the Dead Ringer, then I don't think that no-effort weapons like Jarate and Mad Milk should just be able to straight up expose them immediately. I mean, if you predict where the spy's gonna go and throw Milk at him after 3 seconds, then it's fair game. But when you have this thing that has a gigantic splash radius and can just be thrown in the general direction of the spy and expose them on top of their other effects, it's a little bit unfair. The current Dead Ringer still basically acts like a get-out-of-jail-free card, but it's not one you're going to be able to use super often. And if you don't have it, you're either vulnerable or just waiting for it to recharge. I mean, I guess that's always been kind of true to an extent, but I can't really say that I find the current Dead Ringer to be particularly fun to use or fight against. I think these hypothetical changes could help make the Dead Ringer less annoying to fight while still keeping the same basic function and allowing you to at least partially recharge from ammo. I normally don't really go over ideas for you know, the base of the class. That tends to be a lot more of a deeper topic and obviously affects everything about the class. But I thought I'd mention this idea that I've talked about before. It would give the same bonuses that watches give while cloaks to spies that are disguised. Specifically, that means 20% damage, resistance, and reduced timer on debuffs. Spy as a whole has gotten a fair amount of buffs since the game came out, and I do think that for the most part they've been handled pretty well. But at the same time, Spy's biggest counter, the Pyro, has also been consistently buffed, and other classes have gotten more ways to deal with spies. I made a whole video about this a while back. And, of course, since then, Pyro was buffed again in Jungle Inferno. Toned down again later on, but still. The reason why I think this buff could work is that it will never aid Spy in direct combat. The second the Spy attacks, the whole bonus is lost. And as it is now, there's really no downside to Spy checking. But, it's just a thought. Oh, and also the red tape recorder should maybe, possibly be changed, but I can't think of anything. And, hey, that's all 9 classes. It's done! We're done! It took over a year, but we're done for now. There will be at least one more, and then depending on changes in future updates, we'll see about things after that. I mean, that summer update will be out any day now. Any day. Oh wow, this video is over. Okay, bye!